Welcome to Cultural Economy in the Kitchen, the new podcast from the Journal of Cultural Economy Editorial Collective. I'm Professor Philip Roscoe, Professor of Management at the University of St Andrews School of Business, and I'm co-editor-in-chief of the journal.
And I'm Dr. Addie McGowan, Reviews and Online Content Editor for the Journal. And today I'm hosting my first episode in my new role, Research Associate in Market Studies at the University of Salford.
Today we're talking about cultures and economies of design. It's the design episode. I've got my design tie especially on. And we're welcoming Ulises, Navarro, Aguiar and Karl Palmas to talk about their recent paper, The Design-ification of Future-Making, Uncertainty and Divination in Contemporary Business Discourse.
And you're in for a real treat because we've also got our first try at a guest host, JC Associate Editor Koray Caliskan, here to join the conversation about his beloved topic of design and also dig into the role design thinking plays in his recent co-authored paper, Stacked Economization, a research program for the study of platforms.
So thank you all for joining. Let's introduce our guests, or get our guests to introduce themselves. Ulises, tell us about yourselves and where you're joining us from.
Yes, thank you for having me. My name is Ulises Navarro Aguiar, as you mentioned, and I'm a design scholar interested in the roles that design plays in organizational and economic life. I'm based in Gothenburg, the University of Gothenburg in the west coast of Sweden.
And the question we've been asking all of our guests, what have you been cooking in your kitchen lately?
Well, so we are an international household. So it's a very kind of there's international cuisine in our home. I would say that some of the local favorites are Colombian arepas, but also Mexican quesadillas and tacos, and also a little bit of particularly this time of year, a lot of soups of all kinds.
So, well, that sounds fantastic. I'm wondering how I can wangle an invitation to dinner at Ulises' place. Karl, what about you? Please introduce yourself and tell us where you're joining from.
Right. So I am a associate professor at the Division of Science, Technology and Society at Chalmers University of Technology. I guess you could call me just a sociologist interested in design or design professions, broadly construed.
And what's cooking in your kitchen?
Right now, it's French onion soup, actually. We just came back from, there was this, big Paris Photo photo week. So we were a bit inspired and came back and did some soup. So that's what, you can't smell it, but if you were here, you would smell it. So,
Koray, on to you. Please introduce yourself and say where you're joining us from in your lovely kitchen.
My name is Koray, and I teach economic sociology and design at Parsons School of Design at the New School. I'm joining you from Brooklyn. This is my kitchen. And the last two things that we cooked in this kitchen is I made a charred purple cauliflower that looks very, very beautiful. Charred the whole thing in that oven. And also spinach with minced meat. And I'm Turkish, and we put yogurt on everything, like, spinach, computer, cars. It's like minced meat, spinach with yogurt.
Yum. That sounds great. I'm not Turkish, and I put yogurt on everything too. So nice. Great.
Wonderful. So let's get into it. So first up, we're going to have a discussion of the designification paper with Ulises and Karl. And Addie, over to you.
Great. So to start us off, tell us a bit about what you mean by design and how you become interested in the topic. And Ulises and Karl, feel free to, one of you, jump in.
Yes, absolutely. I can jump in. So I'm based in HTK Valand, the Academy of Art and Design here in Gothenburg. So, and I have a design background. So I was trained as an industrial designer. But then for graduate school, I became quite interested in kind of social sciences and did my PhD in organization studies. So I've always been kind of interested in kind of these kind of interdisciplinary space between design and social sciences. And so this paper kind of started as of different conversations that Karl and I have had over the years. We know each other from a few years back, and always had kind of interesting kind of where exchanging notes and had common interests. And it's things materialized in a particular way where we said, okay, maybe it's interesting to start writing something together. So what we mean by design is very much kind of like we link it to kind of like our own sort of home universities or institutional homes, where in the case of Karl, it's training engineers, and in my case, it's training designers in an applied art tradition. So it's design in a broad sense. So it may include different professions, but that could call themselves designers. So it's a broad understanding of design.
I think for me,
So-
as Ulises was just saying, I come from engineering. My first degree was in engineering, and then I did my PhD in sociology at the London School of Economics. So obviously towards economic sociology, I was supervised by Don Slater of cultural economy fame, I guess I should say. And then when I came back here to Gothenburg, I started working with designers and design scholars. So I had been a part of that for a while. But it was also the case that when I was at my Chalmers home, my Chalmers department, which is the management department, there were people around doing more entrepreneurship studies. And I just realized that within entrepreneurship, there was this whole movement towards including ideas from design or explicitly saying that entrepreneurship is design activity in some way. So I think that's one half of this paper is coming from that. And the other one is obviously more about how design has fed into more strategy, strictly so in this paper.
Even before we get to the paper, I'm just going to kind of backpedal a little bit, because I'm a designophobe, I guess. I don't really know what design is. I mean, is it like kind of doing stuff with Post-its on the wall of a classroom? Is it doing CAD designs of motor engines and bridges, or is it kind of sketching cool stuff for IKEA showrooms? Or explain it to me like, as Jeremy Irons says, like I'm a Labrador or a very small child. What is design?
Sure, I can jump in on that one. I guess kind of one interesting or helpful distinction could be, so what some people have made this distinction between one could call expert design and sort of diffuse design. This is Ezio Manzini, a design theorist, who talks about it in a book called Design When Everybody Designs. And so this idea is that essentially sort of like, if we follow that argument, so design is part of everyone's life in some way, in some measure. To different extents, we are constantly designing. Like, for example, you, Philip, picking up your tie today. That's kind of could be argued that is a form of design decision. And so there's this idea of diffuse design, right? But at the same time, there's also kind of like what some people call expert design, and this is people that have gone through kind of like a design education, and that are kind of like experts in designing particular things. So in the case of architecture, this could be, the built environment in general, but also kind of urban planning is a form of design. And also it can go down to designing artifacts, like in the case of product design, designing visual communications, etc. And so design is a very interesting profession because it's very kind of nimble, and it's always kind of expanding the scope of its scope of application in new terrains. And I think that's also something that we try to capture a bit in the paper.
I think that's just, Philip, it's a really big question. I can see at least three ways of responding to it, and talking about histories and so forth. When I teach design theory for the architecture students at my school, I would start with a history that starts in a discussion about design methods that emerges in the kind of 50s and 60s, a lot driven by architects as well and planners. And a first generation that basically was saying, well, society has gotten so complex now, and the technologies that we're dealing with is so complex, so we need some kind of systematic way of designing things. And that's when you have a kind of a first generation with Chris Alexander and so forth. Then you have a second generation of design scholars coming in who are making the argument that you can't really formalize this too much. So you have the whole discussion about wicked problems and so forth. And then a third one, which is more about, interrogating how designers supposedly think. And this is, by the way, a way of telling this story comes from Nigel Cross, design theorist. I think if you think about people who are doing this kind of work, say in management or in entrepreneurship, you would have more people, I would say, who would lean on Herbert Simon, who would have this really broad definition of design, this distinction between the design sciences versus the natural sciences. The sort of the natural sciences are the ones that distinguish, or tries to establish what exists, and the design sciences are the ones that, move the present to the future in some kind of way that takes us to a better place, or designing artifacts for that future. So that's like two ways of thinking about what design is. But as you sort of allude to it, and as Ulises was saying, especially if you go on the Simon definition, you have a really broad definition of what design is, which can be a bit sort of almost imperial-like, right? That it sort of can expand to all kinds of things. So you could easily say that management then is, in a sense, a design discipline, and so forth. So that's some help, hopefully helpful discussion to start from, I guess.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, we're all design educated, and I know Koray is a design guru, and if you doubted that, just look over his shoulder at the kitchen. But I'm gonna just park you for a moment, Koray, and we'll come back to your design in a little while. Ali.
Yeah, thank you. So then, can y'all both speak to design-ification? So moving from design to design-ification. So it sounds like some social processes revolving around design. Can you explain a bit more as you get into it in the paper?
Yes, absolutely. I think one way of kind of reading the context surrounding the paper. We're very interested in kind of like what you could say kind of like the legacies of design thinking in a way. So design thinking became, we sort of allude that in the background of the paper, but essentially it is about how design sort of like towards kind of like the, late 2000s, so around 2008, 2009, so design thinking started to kind of become a thing in the business world. So the idea of design thinking started to be picked up in business journalism. So business schools started to become very interested in design thinking, this notion of design thinking. There was a number of design firms that were heavily promoting this notion, and basically framing their services as such, as being design thinkers. And it's an interesting history because it's basically kind of like a movement from being product focused or designing hardware and traditional product design towards kind of like using actually the design thinking or design thinking as a form of innovation process. And so these started to kind of like pick up a lot during as I mentioned, 2010s, it started to rise. You would start seeing an uptake of kind of design approaches in different places that were not particularly connected to design before, like, in the public sector, innovation agencies that picked up design discourse and so on. And it became a thing to the point that, we also contextualize it a little bit in the paper. Even big global management consultancies started to become very interested in design, and they were basically merger and acquisition activity around design studios. So by the McKinseys and the BCGs and so on. So this is very interesting then because, when design makes it to kind of like in the mainstream of kind of management orthodoxy, which is these management consulting firms, so it starts to travel in a new way, right? And so it's very interesting to see kind of like what happens with that. But also kind of like around the 2020s, it's kind of like maybe the hype around design thinking starts to fade. And so a lot of people, I mean, the enthusiasm around design is not the same anymore. And so kind of the paper or the idea of design-ification is a little bit sort of like try to trace sort of like how post-design thinking, how design is being kind of like carried on in these different, in these contexts. It is entrepreneurship and strategy are focal cases.
I could just jump in there because it's also so the other part, the one that is more about startups and entrepreneurship, you could very clearly see around the same time span that Ulises was just going through. You could see that there was talk about how to do startups in a new way, basically, or do entrepreneurship in a new way, which is about failing fast and iterating, prototyping, all that kind of stuff. The whole kind of lean startup discourse, which was very much influenced by design as well, explicitly so. So if you read that very sort of influential book by Eric Ries, he explicitly says that he was interested in design thinking when adopting this approach. And then that obviously is the thing that comes into a lot of how startups, the kind of Silicon Valley culture works. That is what VCs are also expecting from you when you are pitching ideas and having some way of hopefully attracting money. And it stretches all the way to when we talk about what's going on now with the tech oligarchy, with SpaceX and all of that. The whole new space phenomenon is also in some way influenced by this idea, I would say. So it stretches all the way to that. One thing, I just should add one thing. I think when we talk about designification, we should probably mention that I think it's not so much in this paper, but in another paper, we're making a clear point that it's actually, it's an emic term, right? It's something that people within the design professions are themselves using when making the claim that the world needs design, or that entrepreneurship practitioners needs design or need to think like designers, or government policymakers should be thinking in design terms. So I think it's worth just making that point clear, because we're obviously talking about the more famous this kind of program of economization and so forth, and the way that Koray is using that ization term is different from how we talk about designification.
Let's bring Koray in. I mean, what's your take on designification?
I really loved the paper that came out from Karl and Ulises. It shows two very important things. Firstly, how design tools are embedded in planning strategies of organizations, thus showing their agency in reconfiguring how organizations approach the future. And the empirical charm of this paper is to show that organizations are now celebrating. Did you see my dog? By the way, Philip, this was my design-loving dog. She'll come and say hi. So going back to the paper from the dog, yeah, she's gonna shout at me to open the door to go out. What's really going on there is that organizations are now tolerating ambiguity and indeterminacy about the future, and integrating this uncertainty in their calculative practices. We didn't see that before. Previously, many scholars who looked at these processes would like to see that, we're planning the future by fictionalizing it. It's like as if there are also non-fictional worlds, non-designed worlds, more natural. So this is why many sociologists using conservative methods to understand novelties fail to understand the integration of design. I'm going to let Effie out.
It's certainly
And
it's certainly the case that and he's off. We'll have a
Yes.
brief musical interlude while Koray puts his dog out. Yeah, I would say
My
edit this
bad.
out afterwards, but I think we'll just keep it in. This is design broadcasting, right? Yeah. So, I mean, it's very interesting, Karl, that you mentioning the SpaceX and so forth, because I saw, as everybody saw, a picture of the cabin of the spacecraft, and I was struck by how designed it was. Whereas the ships that went to the moon were built to go to the moon. You know, they're the most kind of utilitarian Cold War things you can imagine, and you have this ship that looks like somebody's kind of wired a Tesla interior up to a rocket, which is more or less what they've done. What I like about this paper, though, is actually the theoretical engine of it, because it uses two eminent, influential contributions to economics, sociology, and anthropology. You've got Jens Becker and his imagined futures, and then you've got, which I really like, and I keep going back to Laura Baer's work on speculation as a technology of the imagination, and you've kind of mapped these onto these two approaches. So, for the uninitiated, tell us a little bit about Beckett and Baer, and then just tell us how you put them to work in the paper.
Sure. Should I go or should you go, Karl?
You go first. That's fine.
Yeah. So thank you for that question. I think it was kind of like a very interesting kind of like process with that. So initially we were both kind of like simultaneously reading some Beckett at the time of kind of like pre-writing, and so it, you know, we were kind of like very interested in the way he was talking about these different devices, right, that generate these fictional expectations. So his work very much focuses on kind of what are these different devices that, you know, essentially organizations orient themselves towards the future with. And so he basically traces different ones, like intra-organizational, extra-organizational ones, and so on. But the main point is that, you know, in Beckett's work is how these images of the future aren't based in actual knowledge, but actually they're kind of like imagined futures that then generate expectations, which are better understood as fictional because of these relentless uncertainty and so on. So it's very kind of like a sociological reading of kind of future making. And so we were kind of like struck reading that okay, that's quite interesting. But we were seeing, like, you know, Karl and I being familiar with the world of design, and particularly because designers work a lot in future oriented projects. It was very interesting to see a little bit kind of like a certain dissonance that we identified around that it's not that designers are trying to kind of like basically compensate for these not knowing so much as they're actually playing with that uncertainty. They're not trying to tame the uncertainty, as it were, but they're actually kind of like exploiting it and putting it to use. And I think that when we realize this disconnect between what design does and Beckert's image of, you know, these fictional expectations, we then kind of like started to think with Baer, because we thought that her work provides a very good way of understanding this. And maybe Karl wants to say a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So Baer is essentially, like, one of the things that she's doing is writing against both the Beckertian and the Kalonian perspectives or approaches, which she sees as in some ways too information-based, too communicational in some way. My own interest in her work, I've been reading that for a while, and I didn't really know what to make of it. But for a long while, partly when studying these kinds of processes that you see in startups and how they relate to VCs and the kind of A/B testing and everything that they do in order to show that they have, in some way, they're on a path to capture some kind of imagined market out there. So looking at partly at those practices, but also some of the stuff that was happening a few years before, like the whole discussion about big data and the sort of predictive power of big data. And this is obviously now we're also treading a bit into some of the territory that Koray is looking at in the stacked economization paper. But I was always curious about how these claims about the future seemed a bit like divination, or at least the way that it was used. Maybe if you kind of imagine a startup trying to get money from a VC, saying that, oh, we did this beta testing of something, and we did a bit of A/B testing, pseudo-scientific, about how we're again on the right track in some way. But essentially, it's a bit sort of tea leaves, it's like reading tea leaves a bit. So I always felt like this kind of way of thinking about these processes in terms of divination was really interesting, because it also opens other themes and questions regarding power, the kind of the staging of these processes, the effective aspects of them, and so forth. So I think that's what I found interesting with using this BEAR approach to looking at how these claims about the future are being played out in practices.
And I think if the case of strategy is also kind of very interesting in that way, because strategy as a field has had these different schools of thought. But you can really see a shift from kind of so traditional perspective. I mean, strategy as a field, comes from very much kind of attempts to kind of predict and what's going to happen in a particular industry, in a particular market, and basically kind of adapt. So the organization looks for opportunities on how to adapt to these changes. And so kind of the effort of strategy or business policy, as it used to be called earlier, it was basically about trying to find ways to predict these changes. And so strategy then kind of shifted a lot, because then it became much more about, these kind of divinatory aspects. And that's what we try to show in the paper a bit, how the discourse of strategy evolved over time, from wanting to kind of predict and basically, also kind of the Porterian school of strategy, which is very much, derived from industrial economics. So models from economics that are applied to kind of how a firm should orient itself towards the future and so on. But then it's much more about kind of sort of innovation, imagination, and creativity. And so you really see that shift in strategy discourse.
Brilliant. Thank you. So, I'm just skipping through. There's a lovely comment which I'm not sure we have time to really dive into, but you remark about the one of the reasons design is so influential here is because of its imaginative bent and its acute sense of material culture, and we might just hang on to that. But you conclude that design-ification reinforces the promise of an ever more uncertain future, and the affect it generates fuels the speculative imagination in ways which can be both affirming and repudiating of capitalist dynamics. And I wonder, just to finish up, what can design tell us about the way that we encounter cultural economies in late modernity?
Big question.
We do big questions here. We haven't taken up your afternoon to ask little footnote questions. We want the meaning of life, Karl, and you've got about 35 seconds.
I'm sorry. It's like I said, I was minding my microphone too much, so I'm in that space, not in the big space. But okay, yes.
But go ahead, Karl. Have a stab at it.
No, but what can I? I'm still in space in some ways. There's something about how these designerly approaches seem to fit so well with a lot of things going on at the moment, just like I said, in relation to Silicon Valley and the tech scene and so forth. And just to go back to what Ulises was saying, that we seem to have left a world in which a planning approach was the dominant one, where we'd have to fix to kind of eliminate uncertainty and fix the future in some way. And just the example of, old space versus new space. During the kind of old space NASA period, we would actually place people on the moon. Nothing could really go wrong and every project would be 100%. And now the whole new logic is basically to try things out in a lot more speculative way. It doesn't really matter. You can shoot something into the sky, and if it doesn't work, then that's fine. We'll just pivot around in some other direction. So there's something in that which seems to be telling of the in relation to this big question about how this fits into late modernity, whatever that means as a term.
Yes, I would say that. I mean, for me, there's been one book that has been quite influential for me in kind of all these. That has influenced the way I view some of these things is The Invention of Creativity by Andreas Regwitz, which basically, because it's a piece of historical sociology that traces kind of like different, social forces around, kind of like how creativity came to be a thing, essentially. And obviously design and the creative industries play a huge role in that. And in connection to the passage that you just read, Philip, I think that one of the interesting things here for us is also kind of like to see how like the role or the use of uncertainty in all of this. So it seems like in a way design has been particularly kind of like within kind of this design thinking movement. So design was kind of like linked to the idea of innovation. It was a marriage that was made around this time. I mean, not that it wasn't there before, but what I mean is that design basically became almost synonymous with innovation at that point. And so it's very interesting because then design is very helpful in that, it is kind of like a practice that is very imaginative. It tries to kind of like imagine different ways of doing things, imagining alternatives, and that's done through kind of very specific material practices that students are basically kind of enculturated in these practices, when they go to these schools, and typically, particularly in sort of my tradition of design, which is studio pedagogy is the basis for it, where students spend a long time in studios and working with materials and letting the materials talk back to them, and in these circles of reflection and action, these different loops, right? So the design education so students are kind of like prepared to deal with uncertainty. But at the same time, we were very interested in realizing how goes kind of like with the whole idea of novelty and the search for novelty.
Well, yeah, I mean, thank you both. And I think, Ulises, that point that you just made kind of bridges us really nicely to Koray. So Koray, you are a professor of strategic design at a design school, speaking to the student experience that we were just talking about. You also use design as a social research method, which I've done with you across lots of different settings. It's been fantastic. You own a design studio, and design comes through strongly in your theorizing of digital systems in this paper that we're going to be talking about today. So can you kick us off by speaking to the question you started with, by giving an overview of how you think about design throughout these different contexts, and I guess maybe even adding design-ification to that, to those thoughts?
Design is what makes us humans. We are not Homo economicus. We are not Homo faber. We are Homo designus. We become humans by coming together and making things together. And this is the simplest way of designing. And it's not only attached to us, it's also bears and dogs. They also design organizations and do things. They're also actors like us. One thing that differentiates design is that its power to tell stories and listen to stories. We make things with stories. This is very important. We are the only species that needs to tell stories and listen to stories, whether they are scientific, artistic, or, I don't know, journalistic, which actually journalists call it a story, artists call it a story, only scientists stay away from, calling it story. But we are a designing species being, and this is how we do it: organization and storytelling. That's why we need to bring design and this capacity of being human back to our practice, whatever we do. After Second World War, we separated many things. I'm an economist, I'm a sociologist, I do the society, I do the market. These all failed, didn't go anywhere. Then second generation social scientists wanted to show the cultural or the social in the economic, hence the name of our journal. I don't think this works either. I don't think economies are social, and that we should shift from one ambiguity, the economy, to another ambiguity. Now we're going beyond that and building a practice that's transdisciplinary in nature. And I believe design is the glue that brings this together. How are you going to bring together an anthropologist, a sociologist, an economist, and a designer doing things together? We try by using design as a research method with Anne-Marie Ryan, you, Theo Paolo, me, a number of other people in Copenhagen. We're developing this new method of using design as a social research, socio-technical research method. So design makes us. There's nothing good or bad about design. Fascism was a design intervention, so was gender or human rights. We make things by designing, but we still need politics, ethics, and more morality in order to make it a good design, a desirable design. That's why I think that there is a great rapprochement between two big traditions of practice right now in the world: makers and artists, who are increasingly integrating social sciences in their practice, and social scientists who are realizing the social life of things, their agency, and the design nature of what's going on. But for this, we need to have a more expanded understanding of agency, move beyond sociology, and then think about the agency of representations that we call performativity, right? And try to understand the agency of non-humans and other than humans and integrate it into our understanding of relations. And Journal of Cultural Economy might be one of the pioneers of this new way of looking at things. It's only like 12 years old. It's one of the most impactful. And I think it's building one of the ways of making science, design, and future in a new way in the world.
Yeah, no, thank you. And that's a great, I think, segue to your paper in the journal, Stack Economization, a research program for the study of platforms. So in this paper, you and Donald and Michel lay out a research program that kind of rejects classic thinking about platforms as either multi-sided markets or surveillance systems, et cetera, toward that stacked approach. So today, there's so much we could talk about with this paper. But with the theme being design today, everything you just said, focusing on the design elements is almost like an analytical tool for stacked economization in platforms. Can you kind of speak to how thinking through the stacked design of platforms helped you and Donald and Michel analyze them in a new way?
We were looking at platforms and the exponential expansion of platforms in contemporary economies. And we realized that there's two ways of making sense of them. One comes from Kirkcaldy, which is located between Philip and Addie right now, between St. Andrews and Edinburgh, where Adam Smith lived. And he wanted us to understand economies as markets coming together of two forces, supply and demand. Then, new platform studies wanted us to look at platforms as a coming together of supply and demand in a multi-sided way. They called it's a multi-sided market. This is Rocher and Tirole, and many organizations use that conservative way of understanding platforms. Mm-hmm. Platforms are not multi-sided markets. For two obvious reasons. First, platforms like Google, when they don't want to be regulated, they said, oh, we're just multi-sided markets. This is what their lawyers said, right? The second is looking at platforms as consequence, right? This is a genre of doing social science. Laura Baer, for instance, is a consequence scholar. What is the consequence of X on race, class, capitalism, and this and that? That's why she misunderstands Kellon and arguing that Kellon doesn't look at power, all right? This is one of the most important things that Michel looked at, perhaps even the first. So how is it possible to go beyond these two limited approaches to the market? Shoshana Zuboff kind of platforms are terrible, only look at the consequences, or Richo and Tirol way of looking at dragging Adam Smith from Kirkcaldy to today and looking at markets as just looking at platforms as markets. We said there's an alternative. We brought together three things to make sense of platforms. First, they bring together, layer, stack. If I may use a kitchen analogy, like computer scientists do, they stack like cooks stack plates, economization modes. What's an economization
I noticed
mode?
that.
Markets, barter, gift. Take out barter, Google collapses. Take out barter, Facebook doesn't work. YouTube doesn't work. It's the most central platform technology, right? So first, stacking of modes of economization. Two, they are exploratoriums. They look at us, platforms look at us, but we also look at them. We look at each other. We explore things. It's not only platform doing things to poor actors. Actors are doing things to platform and with them. I critique Google, but without Google Maps, I'm nothing. I love Google Maps because it gives me an opportunity to explore my city in a new way, but also takes away things from me. And third and more important, platforms are spaces of power. You understand a platform, these three things, and it gives you four wonderful opportunities. First, understand better. Two, make platforms better. Three, regulate platforms better. And more importantly, tax platforms. We don't have even a language to regulate and tax barter.
So with all of this, I mean, yes, this is a fantastic, I think, application of what we're talking about today more broadly with design and using it to analyze something very complicated. But with this, I mean, I want to bring it back to something that Ulises, I think you said, or Karl, about design in the 2020s being dead, or do you think the hype around design is fading? So I wanted to kind of invite you, Koray, to speak to that. And then Karl and Ulises, feel free to jump back in.
Is it me or Ulises now?
Go for it, Koray.
Okay, all right. First, I agree with Ulises that design thinking was an intervention device, a design device to put design at the center of organizational renovation. However, we don't use it as an analytical concept at Parsons School of Design. We critique it. Why? Design thinking. It's like design is already a way of thinking. So when you say design thinking, it's like you try to explain a philosopher. It's like, oh, I have a very good idea, philosophy thinking. I was like, what are you talking about? You can't say philosophy thinking, right? So for serious design theorists, design thinking is a marketing device. It's not an analytical device we use to teach design at Parsons. And many of my colleagues at Parsons criticize it. But however, it made design a popular term. And now when you put design next to anything, it sells. People are interested. What AI is in economies, design is in scholarship right now, which is great. So now we see an institutionalization of design with new methods approaching. But there's a problem. Designers are trained to tolerate ambiguity. Scientists are trained to kill it. How did you become a doctor of philosophy? If you write something ambiguous, Addy, it would be no. Scientists don't like that. How is it possible to put one hand in cold water, one hand in hot water? This is what we are trying to develop right now with using design as method. First, let's tolerate ambiguity and also try to get rid of it, because you can't describe a design method in an ambiguous way. So designers realized that, opened themselves to scientists. Parsons School of Design has many scientists with big impact publications, right? We are scientists and designers and artists together precisely because of that. So that's why we wrote a design method in strategic design, DARN 1 and DARN 2. I wrote it with my design partner, Matt Robb, who's in London. Hi, Matt, if you're watching it. And this is not an ambiguous way of talking about design and how to deploy it on the ground. However,
So-
when you're in the studio, when you're making, you gotta tolerate it. Sorry, Philip.
So I was going to bring in Karl and Ulises. Are you sold? Koray's pitching. Are you sold, or are you still cynics, skeptics of the rise of the continued rise of design?
I think there's different ways of like, is design dead? No. Like, for myself, I still find that ultimately I am a teacher of design students, and I'm interested in design professions. Yeah. No, I'm not that much of a cynic in that way. But I guess empirically speaking, again, if you look at what's going on, there was a moment in late 2010s where design was very big, say in the VC world, whereas today you would have people like Mark Andreessen who would sort of pour scorn over that and say, well, there used to be a time when all the VCs should be designers, and that's not the case anymore. So there is some kind of backlash, I guess. And I guess it's also, if I come across as a bit of a cynic, it's partly because I've been also doing work on design or within more design studies, looking maybe particularly at planning, about how design is not always good. Designers are not always working for the good. There's also negative outcomes of design processes. So there's that as well. But we don't have time to go into that now, but that's one thing to bear in mind.
Yeah. I mean, I would only add that, yeah, I agree with Koray in that, when I say kind of like the hype around design kind of faded, that doesn't mean that there's no longer design or that the opportunities for design are over, but it's more like, the idea of design thinking as such, exactly like Koray described, the marketing ploy, you could say, around it. So for me, it's a very kind of interesting and productive time for design, where there's very interesting, so like we're past hype, so there's very interesting opportunities. And I do think that, with kind of like the performativity turn, it's very interesting kind of like these rapprochements that Koray is talking about, how sort of that there's a lot of in the design field, there's something called research through design or design practice research. That is, I think it's a very interesting tradition that, people interested in what happens after performativity, what does performativity do to the way we carry out research, that I think there's a very fertile ground for a lot of interesting explorations in that context.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that is a nice segue into kind of my wrap-up question for you, Koray. If we're kind of in the design turn of maybe studying these complex systems, what's your advice for us in encountering them as social scientists? For example, your fundamental claim is that platforms and the stacks within platforms are kind of that foundational unit of economization. So how can we kind of take this post-design turn, design as a great method or analytical tool even, forward as we study these ever-growing, even more complex systems as they evolve?
One way is to understand their design nature and then start from that. Yeah. The socio-technical architecture of those systems. Because if we don't do them, we try to drag them to understand this, but platforms are really social. They are cultural. They are economic. What is the point of trying to say that? We know that they are already everything at the same time. So we got to drop this post-war language of a implication, hierarchy of implication. Are they really economic? Are they? And then try to understand their economization principles. And if we do that, we give actors tools, theoretical tools, to make sense of platforms better, critique them better, and also fix them better. If I may give an example, In my book, Data Money on Cryptocurrency Platforms, I explained how decentralized finance works. And then IRS picked up stack taxation. In order to locate a tax event, you can't tax anything without an event, like selling of a house, right? A tax event. And then introduce a tax instrument and called it stacked taxation. Why? Because this was a gain that did not touch on US dollar, not monetized in terms of fiat, but only say you make money from by selling Ethereum via Avalanche coin, AVAX, right? How do you tax that? And they figured that out. So I think we can find a better way to describe platforms in this stacked economization program. And this also addresses the shortcomings of, say, studying of a future as fictional. Like this is Karl Polanyi. There are 3 fictional commodities. Really? Oil is not fictional? Show me one commodity that is not fictionalized. It's not land, labor, or money only. So we can't talk about fiction as if it's an exception. This is what we do as humans. That's what Jens Becker doesn't understand. That's why Karl Polanyi doesn't understand. They locate it as if fictionalization or design-ification is an exception. It's not. It is the central trait of human organizations, as Karl and Ulises very nicely show.
And on that point, Koray, because if we're in search of big claims and big answers, I simply don't think we can get bigger than that. So I think it's time that we wrap up this wonderful discussion. And I'd like to thank you all. Thank you, our guests. That's Ulises, Navarro, Aguiar, Karl, Palmas, and Koray Caliskan.
You've been listening to, or maybe watching, Cultural Economy in the Kitchen from the Journal of Cultural Economy I'll do that again, Charlie. All right, you've been listening to...
Eddie, this is so beautiful. This is beautiful television. Don't fix that. This is so beautiful. Everyone is going to love it. And put this on too. That's good television, and I'm sorry for talking like Donald Trump.
All right, you've been listening to, or maybe watching, Cultural Economy in the Kitchen from the Journal of Cultural Economy Editorial Collective. Today's episode was produced by C. Ross Cinematics. You'll find links to the papers at the end of the video if you're watching on YouTube, and don't forget to like and subscribe, tell your friends, and share.
Join us next time for another serving of goodies from our intellectual smorgasbord. Until then, it's goodbye.